The frozen wind cut through the Ardennes forest like 1,000 knives. Oberst Heinrich Müller stood beside his Panther tank, watching his breath turn to fog in the bitter December air. It was 1944, and the war was slipping through Germany's fingers like sand. His elite Panzer division, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, now faced an enemy more dangerous than American guns. They were running out of fuel. Müller was not an ordinary officer. He had fought across France, survived the Russian winter, and earned his reputation through blood and iron. His men called him the Iron Wolf because he never retreated and never gave up. His division had 60 tanks, the best Germany could build. Panther tanks with thick armor and powerful guns. Tiger tanks that made Allied soldiers run in fear. But right now, these mechanical beasts were dying of thirst. The Battle of the Bulge had started 3 days ago. Hitler himself had ordered this massive offensive. It was Germany's last chance to split the Allied forces and reach the port of Antwerp. The plan was bold and desperate. Push through the weak American lines in Belgium, capture their fuel supplies, and drive to the sea. But plans meant nothing without fuel. Müller's tanks were drinking their last drops of gasoline. Inside his command tent, Müller studied the maps under the yellow light of a kerosene lamp. His chief of staff, Major Hartmann, stood beside him with dark circles under his eyes. Nobody had slept properly in weeks. The cold was brutal. Soldiers were getting frostbite. Some tanks would not even start in the morning because the oil had frozen solid. "How much fuel do we have left?" Müller asked, though he already knew the answer would be bad. Hartmann checked his clipboard. "Enough for maybe 50 kilometers. Some tanks have less. We are siphoning fuel from broken vehicles to keep the others moving." Müller slammed his fist on the table. 50 kilometers was nothing. They needed to advance 200 kilometers to reach their objectives. Without fuel, they were just sitting targets for American bombers. A radio operator burst into the tent, his face red from the cold. "Sir, urgent message from High Command." Müller grabbed the decoded message and read it quickly. His eyes widened. Intelligence had intercepted American radio communications. There was a fuel depot in a town called Stavelot, just 30 kilometers away. The Americans had abandoned it during their retreat 2 days ago. The message said the depot contained 50,000 gallons of high-quality American gasoline. 50,000 gallons. That was enough to fuel his entire division for weeks. "Get the officers here now," Müller ordered. His voice was suddenly energized. "We move tonight." Within an hour, his tank commanders gathered in the tent. Among them was Lieutenant Klaus Weber, a young officer with sharp blue eyes and a talent for keeping his tank running even in impossible conditions. Weber was only 23 but had already survived battles that killed men twice his age. Müller explained the situation. "Gentlemen, we have been given a gift. A fuel depot at Stavelot. 50,000 gallons of American gasoline, sitting there waiting for us. We take it tonight, or we die here frozen in these woods." The officers looked at each other. They knew this was their only chance. Some smiled. Others looked worried. Weber raised his hand. "Sir, what about enemy resistance? The Americans would not leave such valuable fuel unguarded." Müller nodded. "Intelligence says only a small engineering unit is there. Perhaps 50 men. They were left behind to guard supply routes. We have 60 tanks and 800 men. It will not be a battle. It will be a slaughter." The plan was simple. They would move under cover of darkness. The forest roads were barely passable, but they had no choice. Speed was everything. If the Americans realized what was happening, they might destroy the fuel depot before the Germans could reach IT-9 in the evening. The Panzers began to roll. The sound of engines echoed through the frozen forest. Tank commanders wore their winter gear, but the cold still found ways to torture them. The temperature was 20 degrees below zero. Men had to chip ice off their periscopes to see. The tanks moved slowly, their tracks crunching through snow and ice. Müller rode in the lead Panther, his tank painted with the marks of many victories. He could feel the vibration of the engine through his boots. The fuel gauge was almost on empty. This was gambling everything on one desperate throw of the dice. Weber's tank followed close behind. He watched the dark forest pass by, thinking about his family back in Bavaria. His mother's last letter had arrived 3 weeks ago. She wrote about how cold the winter was, how hard it was to find food. She did not know her son was fighting for his life in an even colder place. In a war Germany was losing. The radio crackled with reports. The column was moving slower than planned. Two tanks had mechanical problems and had to be left behind. Another tank slid off the icy road and got stuck. Every delay meant burning more precious fuel. Muller ordered them to keep moving. Nothing could stop them now. At midnight, they saw lights ahead. Stavelot. The small Belgian town sat in a valley, its buildings covered in snow. Muller raised his binoculars. He could see American trucks parked near a large warehouse on the edge of town. That had to be the fuel depot. There were only a few guards visible, stamping their feet to stay warm. Muller smiled grimly. The Americans had no idea death was coming for them out of the frozen darkness. He gave the order to his gunner. The Panther's 75mm gun roared, and the first shell screamed toward the town. The battle for the fuel had begun. The explosion lit up the night sky like a small sun. American soldiers scrambled for cover. Some were still in their sleeping bags when the shells started falling. Captain Robert Hayes, the commander of the American engineering unit, grabbed his rifle and ran outside. His heart sank when he saw the German tanks emerging from the forest. There were so many of them. "Fall back," Hayes shouted. "Fall back to the forest. Move." His men grabbed what they could and ran. There was no point fighting 60 tanks with 50 engineers. They would be massacred. Hayes took one last look at the fuel depot as he ran. He prayed the Germans would not find what was really inside those barrels. Then he disappeared into the trees, and the Germans rolled into Stavelot unopposed. The fuel was theirs. Or so they thought. The dawn came cold and gray over Stavelot. Muller's tanks sat like sleeping giants around the warehouse that held their salvation. His men had worked through the night, securing the town and setting up defensive positions. Now, as the winter sun tried to break through the clouds, they finally had time to claim their prize. The warehouse was bigger than Muller had expected. It was an old brick building that the Americans had converted into a supply depot. Inside, stacked in neat rows, were hundreds of 50-gallon drums marked with U.S. Army labels. The smell of gasoline filled the air. Some of the drums had already been opened by the Americans before they fled. Muller walked between the rows with Major Hartmann, counting the barrels. His chief mechanic, Feldwebel Ernst Koch, was already testing the fuel. Koch was a gray-haired man from Munich who had been working on engines since before the war. He could tell the quality of fuel just by looking at it. "What do you think, Koch?" Muller asked. Koch dipped a measuring stick into one of the open drums. He pulled it out and studied the liquid. "It is gasoline, sir. American fuel. Very high quality. Better than what we have been using." He paused, frowning slightly. "But something is strange." "What do you mean, strange?" Koch held up the stick so Muller could see. "Look at how thin it is. How quickly it drips off. Good gasoline should be thicker, more viscous. This is almost like water." Muller felt a knot form in his stomach, but he pushed the feeling away. Maybe American fuel is different from ours. Maybe they make it thinner for their engines. Koch did not look convinced, but he nodded. "Perhaps, sir. I will run more tests." Muller could not afford to wait for tests. His division was paralyzed without fuel. Every hour they stayed here made them more vulnerable to American counterattacks. He gave the order to begin refueling immediately. His tank crews got to work. The refueling process was slow and careful. Each Panther tank held 200 gallons of fuel. The Tigers held even more. The men formed chains, rolling the heavy drums to the tanks and using hand pumps to transfer the fuel. It was hard, cold work. Their hands froze to the metal. Some men slipped on the ice and spilled precious gasoline. But they kept working because they knew this fuel meant survival. Lieutenant Weber supervised the refueling of his own tank, a Panther named Brunhild, after the warrior woman from German legends. He watched as his crew pumped the American fuel into the tank's fuel cells. Like Koch, he noticed something odd about the liquid. It seemed too thin, and when some splashed on the ground, it did not leave the oily residue that normal gasoline left. "Sergeant," Weber called to his gunner, "does this fuel look right to you?" His gunner, a veteran named Steiner, squinted at the barrel. "I do not know, sir. I am not a mechanic. But it does look strange." Weber decided to report his concerns to Major Hartmann. He found the major standing beside Muller's command tank, drinking ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns. Real coffee had disappeared from the German army months ago. "Sir, I have concerns about the fuel," Weber said. Hartmann looked tired and irritated. "What concerns? It seems thin, watery, not like normal gasoline. Maybe we should test it more thoroughly before we put it in all our tanks." Hartmann glanced at Muller, who was standing nearby listening. The Oberst's face was hard as stone. "We do not have time for more tests, Lieutenant. We need to move by tonight. If we stay here too long, the Americans will send bombers or artillery. Do you want to be sitting here when the shells start falling?" Weber knew better than to argue with his commanders. He saluted and returned to his tank. But the uneasy feeling stayed with him. Something was wrong with this fuel. He could feel it in his bones. While the Germans worked, Captain Hayes watched from the forest through his binoculars. He was hiding in a makeshift observation post dug into the snow, about 800 meters from the town. His men were scattered through the woods, cold and miserable, but alive. They had radioed for reinforcements, but help was at least 2 days away. Hayes counted the German tanks. 60 of them, maybe more. It was a full Panzer division. His small unit stood no chance in direct combat. All he could do was watch and report their movements to headquarters. Then Hayes remembered something. He had grabbed several documents when they evacuated the warehouse. Among them was a maintenance log that his predecessor had kept. Hayes pulled the crumpled papers from his jacket and read them by the dim morning light. His blood turned to ice when he saw the entry dated 3 weeks earlier. His predecessor, a lieutenant named Morrison, had written in red ink, "Warning, drums in Section C contain mixed fluids. Gasoline contaminated with hydraulic fluid from engineering equipment. Do not use for vehicles. Marked for disposal. Section C." Hayes looked through his binoculars at the warehouse. The Germans were taking fuel from all sections, including Section C. They had no idea what they were putting into their tanks. Hydraulic fluid was used in construction equipment, in landing craft, in dozens of different machines. It looked similar to gasoline, but was completely different. If you mixed it with gasoline and ran it through a tank engine, it would cause catastrophic damage. The fuel injectors would clog. The filters would fail. The entire fuel system would destroy itself from the inside. Hayes almost laughed at the absurd irony. The Germans had come looking for fuel to save their division. Instead, they had found poison that would kill their tanks more effectively than any American weapon. Morrison's accident, mixing the fluids during a rushed supply operation, had created the perfect trap, but Hayes was not a cruel man. He knew those German tank crews were just soldiers like him, following orders, trying to stay alive. He briefly considered trying to warn them somehow. Then he remembered the villages the Germans had destroyed, the civilians they had killed, the war they had started. He put the papers back in his jacket and said nothing to WWII afternoon. All 60 German tanks had been refueled. The drums were empty. The Germans loaded the barrels onto trucks to take them along for future use. Muller gathered his officers for a final briefing. "Gentlemen, we move at dawn tomorrow. Our target is the American supply depot at Trois-Ponts, 40 kilometers west. With full tanks, we can reach it easily and resupply there. After that, we push toward the Meuse River. The Americans are in chaos. This is our moment." His officers cheered. Their tanks were full. Their spirits were high. They felt like they had been given a second chance. Only Koch, the old mechanic, remained quiet. He had run more tests on the fuel and found traces of something that was not gasoline. But when he tried to report it to Muller, he was told to stop worrying. The time for doubt was over. The time for action had come. That night, the Germans slept in the captured buildings of Stavelot, their tanks parked in neat rows, their fuel tanks full of poison. In the forest, Hayes radioed his report to headquarters. He told them about the contaminated fuel, but said he was not sure how much the Germans had taken. Then he settled down in his frozen foxhole to wait for whatever would happen next. Neither side knew it yet, but the battle was already over. The Germans had already lost. The fuel in their tanks was a ticking time bomb, counting down to disaster. The first light of dawn broke across the snow-covered hills of Belgium. Muller stood in the commander's hatch of his Panther tank, watching his division prepare to move. 60 tanks, 800 men, all of them ready to strike deep into American territory. The fuel depot at Trois-Ponts was waiting. After that, who knew? Maybe they could still turn the war around. "All units, prepare to move out," Muller spoke into his radio. "Column formation. Keep intervals of 50 meters. We move fast, and we move hard." The engines roared to life. The sound echoed through the valley like thunder. Black exhaust smoke poured from the tanks as they warmed up their engines. It was a sound that had terrified Allied soldiers for years. The sound of German armor on the move. Weber's Panther, Brunhild, was positioned fifth in the column. He climbed into the turret and settled into the commander's seat. His crew was ready. Steiner on the gun, Fisher the loader, Hoffman the driver. They had been together since France. They trusted each other with their lives. "Start the engine, Hoffman," Weber ordered. The engine caught and rumbled to life. But immediately, Weber heard something wrong. The engine sounded rough, uneven. It was coughing like a sick man. He had heard this Maybach engine run 1,000 times before. It had always purred like a giant cat. Now it sounded like it was choking. "Hoffman, check the gauges," Weber said into the intercom. "Oil pressure is normal, sir. Temperature is rising normally. But the engine sounds terrible." Weber frowned. Maybe it was just the cold. Tank engines always ran rough in extreme weather. He would give it a few minutes to warm up. The column began to move. Muller's tank led the way, climbing out of the valley and onto the main road heading west. The Panthers and Tigers followed, their tracks grinding through the ice and snow. For the first 500 meters, everything seemed fine. Then the first tank stopped. It was a Panther in the middle of the column. Its engine had simply died. The tank rolled to a halt, blocking the road. The commander stood up in his hatch, waving his arms in confusion. Behind him, other tanks had to stop to avoid collision. Muller's voice crackled over the radio. "What is happening back there? Why have we stopped?" "Tank number 12 has engine failure, sir," came the reply. "Get it off the road. Use tow cables. We cannot stop now." But before they could attach the tow cables, another tank stopped. Then another. Within 10 minutes, 5 tanks had suffered engine failures. All of them showed the same symptoms. The engines would run rough for a few minutes, then lose power, then die completely. No amount of coaxing could get them restarted. Weber felt Brunhild's engine starting to shudder beneath him. The gauges were going crazy. The fuel pressure was dropping. The engine temperature was rising too fast. Something was very, very wrong. "Hoffman, shut it down. Shut it down now, before we damage the engine further." The engine died with a final cough of black smoke. Weber climbed out of his tank and jumped down to the ground. All around him, he could see other tank commanders doing the same thing. Panic was spreading through the column like wildfire. Muller's command tank pulled over to the side of the road. The Oberst climbed out, his face red with fury. "Koch, get over here now." The chief mechanic came running, carrying his toolbox. He looked terrified. He had warned them about the fuel. Nobody had listened. "What is happening to my tanks?" Muller demanded. Koch knelt beside the nearest dead Panther and opened the engine access panels. The smell that came out was wrong. It was not the normal smell of diesel or gasoline. It was something chemical, something that did not belong in a tank engine. "Sir, we need to drain the fuel and check the fuel system," Koch said. "We do not have time for that. Can you fix these tanks or not?" Koch pulled out one of the fuel filters. It was completely clogged with a thick, brown sludge. He held it up for Muller to see. "Sir, this is not just gasoline. There is something else mixed in. Some kind of oil or fluid that does not burn properly. It is clogging everything. The fuel injectors, the carburetors, the lines. Everything." The truth hit Muller like a hammer. The fuel depot had been contaminated. The Americans had not abandoned 50,000 gallons of good fuel. They had left behind 50,000 gallons of poison, and he had pumped it into every single one of his tanks. "How many tanks are affected?" Muller asked, his voice quiet now, deadly calm. A lieutenant ran up with a report. "Sir, we have 23 tanks completely dead. Another 15 are running rough and losing power. Only 22 tanks are still operational, and they are showing early symptoms." 22 tanks. Out of 60. In less than an hour, his elite Panzer division had been reduced to barely one-third strength. Not by enemy fire, not by brave American soldiers, but by contaminated fuel. Weber approached Muller cautiously. "Sir, we need to evacuate the bad fuel immediately. Maybe we can save some of the tanks if we act now." Muller looked at him with empty eyes. "And replace it with what, Lieutenant? We used all our remaining fuel to get here. We are in the middle of nowhere. The nearest German supply depot is 80 kilometers away. We do not have enough working tanks to fight our way back there." The radio crackled with new reports. American artillery observers had spotted the stopped German column. Shells were being called in. The first explosions landed 200 meters away, throwing up fountains of snow and frozen earth. "All units, defensive positions," Muller ordered. "Spread out. Crews that cannot move their tanks, prepare to fight as infantry." The German soldiers scrambled to obey. They knew they were in terrible trouble. A Panzer division's strength was its mobility, its ability to strike fast and disappear before the enemy could respond. Now they were stuck on a road. Their precious tanks turned into 40-ton paperweights. More artillery shells fell, closer this time. One landed directly on a disabled Tiger tank. The explosion was enormous. The tank's ammunition cooked off, sending its turret flying 30 meters into the air. 3 crew members died instantly. Koch worked frantically with his mechanics, trying to save whatever tanks they could. They drained the bad fuel, cleaned the filters, flushed the fuel lines. Some tanks could be restarted, but they only ran for a few minutes before dying again. The contamination had gone too deep into the fuel system. Proper repairs would take days and specialized equipment they did not have. Weber helped his crew push Brunhild off the road. Without engine power, the 30-ton tank was almost impossible to move. They used logs as rollers and the crew's remaining strength. Inch by inch, they got it into a defensive position behind a small hill. WWII noon. The situation had become desperate. American fighter planes appeared in the sky. P-47 Thunderbolts. The Germans called them Jabo for Jag Bomber. The pilots saw the sitting ducks below and dove to attack. Machine guns raked the column. Rockets streaked down, blowing apart disabled tanks. Muller watched his division being destroyed from his command post in a farm building. He had radioed high command for help, for fuel, for anything. The reply had been cold and simple. No fuel available. Hold your position until reinforcements arrive. But everyone knew reinforcements were not coming. Germany had nothing left to send. We fought across Europe, Hartmann said quietly, standing beside Muller. We survived Russia. We survived France. And now we die here because of bad gasoline. Is this not the most ridiculous thing you have ever heard? Muller did not answer. He was watching through binoculars as another of his tanks burned. Inside that tank were boys who trusted him. Boys who followed his orders. Boys who thought he could lead them to victory. Now they were dying because he had been too desperate, too eager to believe in a miracle. In the forest, Captain Hayes watched the German division tear itself apart. He felt no joy in it. War was not about joy. It was about survival. His radio crackled with new orders. American forces were moving up to encircle the stranded Germans. The end was coming soon. Weber sat on the frozen ground beside Brunhild, his faithful tank that would never move again. He thought about his mother's letter, about home, about all the things he would never see again. The contaminated fuel had not just destroyed the tanks. It had destroyed their future. All of them knew it now. This was the end. The afternoon sun was hidden behind thick clouds that promised more snow. Muller stood in the ruins of a Belgian farmhouse, looking at the maps spread across a broken table. Red marks showed where his tanks had died. Black marks showed where American forces were closing in. He was surrounded, outgunned, and out of options. The artillery fire had not stopped for 3 hours. American 105mm howitzers were pounding his positions from multiple directions. Every few minutes, a shell would land among his scattered vehicles, sending metal and men flying. The farm buildings that his troops used for cover were being reduced to rubble piece by piece. "Sir, the Americans are requesting our surrender," a radio operator reported. "They say if we do not surrender by nightfall, they will call in heavy bombers." Muller almost laughed. Surrender. The word tasted like poison. He had never surrendered in his life. He had earned the Knight's Cross for holding impossible positions. He had fought when others ran. But what was the point of fighting now? His tanks were dead. His men were dying. For what? For a madman's dream in Berlin. How many tanks are still operational? Muller asked Hartmann. 14, sir. But only 8 have enough ammunition to fight. The others are almost empty. 14 tanks out of 60. The rest were scattered along the road like the corpses of steel dinosaurs. Some were burning. Some were just silent, their engines destroyed by the contaminated fuel. Muller's elite division, the formation that had terrorized Allied forces from France to Belgium, had been killed by a mistake, by bad fuel that nobody had properly tested. Outside, the sound of tank engines approached. American engines. The Shermans were coming. Hayes and his engineering unit had been reinforced by a full armored battalion. 30 Sherman tanks, along with infantry and tank destroyers. The Germans were outnumbered, immobile, and nearly out of ammunition. Weber crouched behind Brunhild with his crew. They had stripped the machine guns from their dead tank and set up a defensive position. All around them, other tank crews had done the same. Elite Panzer soldiers, trained to fight from inside powerful armored vehicles, were now reduced to common infantry, hiding in the snow. "Do you think they will accept our surrender?" Fisher asked. The young loader was only 19 years old. His hands shook, not from cold but from fear. "The Americans treat prisoners well," Weber said, trying to sound confident. "Better than the Russians would, anyway. If we surrender, we will survive this war." Steiner spat in the snow. "I did not join the Panzer troops to surrender. I joined to fight." "Then you are a fool," Weber said quietly. "Fighting now is suicide. We have lost. The fuel killed us before the Americans could." The sound of American tanks grew louder. Hayes rode in the lead Sherman, standing in the commander's hatch. He could see the German positions clearly now. Disabled tanks everywhere. Soldiers in gray uniforms running between positions. Some were trying to dig foxholes in the frozen ground. Others were trying to repair their vehicles with whatever tools they had. Hayes felt a strange mix of emotions. These were the same German soldiers who had killed his friends, who had destroyed villages and murdered civilians. But they were also just men, trapped in a hopeless situation. He picked up his radio handset. "German commander, this is Captain Robert Hayes of the United States Army. You are completely surrounded. Your tanks are disabled. You have no fuel and no way to escape. I am giving you 1 hour to surrender. If you do not, we will destroy your entire force. You have my word that prisoners will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. Your men do not have to die today." There was a long silence. Then Muller's voice came back, speaking in heavily accented English. "How do I know you will honor your word?" "Because I am an American officer, not a murderer," Hayes replied. "I have no desire to kill men who cannot fight back. But if you force me to attack, I will. And your men will die for nothing." In the farmhouse, Muller looked at his officers. They were exhausted, hungry, and scared. Some were very young, barely 20 years old. Others were veterans who had survived years of war. All of them looked at him, waiting for his decision. "We could try to break out on foot," one young captain suggested. "Abandon the tanks and vehicles. Move through the forest at night." Koch shook his head. "It is 20 degrees below zero. We would freeze to death before we got 10 kilometers. Half the men already have frostbite. Then we make a last stand," another officer said. "Go down fighting. Like soldiers." Muller looked at him with tired eyes. "And achieve what? We all die, the Americans lose maybe 10 men, and the war continues exactly as it was. Germany still loses. Berlin still falls. We just make a few more widows and orphans for no reason." He walked to the window and looked out at his destroyed division. Boys in steel coffins. Boys who had trusted him to lead them to glory. Instead, he had led them here, to this frozen Belgian road where they would die or surrender. "The war is already lost," Muller said quietly. "Germany is finished. Hitler's madness has destroyed us. The only question now is how many more men must die before it is over." Hartmann put a hand on his shoulder. "The men will follow whatever order you give. You know that." Muller nodded. He knew. That was what made the decision so hard. These soldiers would follow him into hell if he asked. But he could not ask them to die for nothing. Not anymore. He picked up the radio handset. His hand shook slightly as he pressed the transmit button. "Captain Hayes, this is Oberst Heinrich Muller. I agree to your terms. We will surrender. But I have conditions. My wounded must be treated immediately. My men must be given shelter and food. And no reprisals against civilians in the area." "Agreed," Hayes replied immediately. "Have your men stack their weapons and gather in the open ground by the road. Officers can keep their sidearms until the formal surrender. We will provide medical care and food." Muller took a deep breath. "We will comply. Give us 30 minutes to organize." He switched off the radio and turned to face his officers. Some looked relieved. Others looked ashamed. Weber, who had just entered the farmhouse, stood at attention and saluted. "Sir, my crew and I volunteer to stay behind and cover the surrender, in case the Americans do not honor their word." Muller shook his head. "No, Lieutenant. We all go together. We started this war together, and we will end it together." He raised his voice so all the officers could hear. "Pass the word to all units. Ceasefire. Stack weapons. Prepare to surrender. Any man who wants to try escaping on his own, I will not stop him. But I recommend surrender. We have fought bravely. We have nothing to be ashamed of. The fault lies with those who sent us here with false promises and bad fuel. The next 30 minutes felt like hours. German soldiers emerged from their positions, carrying their wounded comrades. They stacked their rifles, machine guns, and Panzerfausts in neat piles. Some men were crying. Others looked relieved. Most just looked empty, hollow from exhaustion and shock. Weber helped carry a badly wounded sergeant to the collection point for casualties. The man had been hit by shrapnel during the artillery barrage. He kept asking if they were retreating to regroup. Weber did not have the heart to tell him the truth. Muller walked among his men one last time as their commander. He stopped to speak with some, putting his hand on shoulders, offering quiet words. When he reached Koch, the old mechanic was sitting on the ground with his head in his hands. "I should have insisted," Koch said. "I should have refused to refuel the tanks until we did proper tests. This is my fault." "No," Muller said firmly. "This is my fault. I gave the order. I was desperate. I wanted to believe in the miracle fuel so badly that I ignored the warnings. The men died because of my decision, not yours." As the sun began to set, painting the snow red and gold, the German soldiers gathered in the open ground. 800 men who had started the day as an elite panzer division. Now they were just prisoners, waiting to be taken away. Their mighty tanks sat silent around them, killed by contaminated fuel more effectively than any weapon. American soldiers moved in cautiously, weapons ready. But there was no fight left in the Germans. Hayes walked through the prisoners, looking for Muller. When he found him, the two officers faced each other. Muller unbuckled his pistol belt and handed it over formally. "Your division?" Hayes asked. "Destroyed," Muller replied in English. 50,000 gallons of your bad fuel accomplished what months of fighting could not." Hayes nodded slowly. He pulled out the maintenance log from his jacket and showed Muller the warning written in red ink. "This was an accident. My predecessor mixed the fluids by mistake. We were supposed to dispose of it, but we evacuated before we could." Muller read the entry and actually smiled, though there was no humor in it. "So we were defeated by a clerk's error, not by your superior tactics or brave soldiers. By a simple mistake." He looked back at his ruined tanks. "Perhaps that is fitting. This entire war has been a mistake from the beginning." As darkness fell, American trucks arrived to transport the prisoners. The wounded went first, loaded carefully onto medical vehicles. The rest would march to temporary camps, then eventually to permanent prisoner of war facilities. They would sit out the rest of the war behind wire fences while their country burned. Weber took one last look at Brunhild as he climbed onto a truck, his faithful Panther tank that had carried him through so many battles. Now she would rust here in Belgium, a monument to the war's stupidity. He touched the Iron Cross on his uniform, the medal he had earned for bravery. It felt worthless now. The trucks rolled away into the night, carrying the remains of Muller's division into captivity. Behind them, the 60 dead tanks sat in the snow like tombstones, marking the grave of Germany's last great offensive. The Battle of the Bulge would continue for another month, but everyone knew now that Germany had lost. The contaminated fuel had not just destroyed one division. It had destroyed the last hope point. 3 months later, the war in Europe was ending. Allied armies were closing in on Berlin from all sides. Russian soldiers were fighting street by street through German cities. American and British forces had crossed the Rhine River. The Third Reich, which Hitler had promised would last 1,000 years, was collapsing after only 12. Captain Robert Hayes sat in a military office in Brussels, writing his final report on the incident at Stavelot. The paperwork had taken months to complete. Investigations, interviews, analysis. The U.S. Army wanted to understand exactly what had happened. How had one contaminated fuel depot destroyed an entire German panzer division? Hayes wrote carefully, choosing his words. He explained how Lieutenant Morrison had accidentally mixed hydraulic fluid with gasoline during a rushed supply operation in November. How the contamination had been noted but not acted upon quickly enough. How the Germans had captured the depot and refueled their entire division with the poison mixture. How 60 tanks had been disabled within hours, but Hayes left out some details. He did not mention that he had known about the contamination when he watched the Germans refuel. He did not mention his brief moment of considering warning them. Some truths were better left unwritten. War was not a place for moral perfection. It was a place for survival. The door opened, and a colonel entered. Hayes stood and saluted. The colonel returned the salute and sat down, gesturing for Hayes to do the same. I have read your report, Captain. Remarkable story. One of the strangest victories of the war. The colonel paused. Intelligence wants to know if this could be done deliberately. Could we contaminate enemy fuel supplies on purpose? Hayes felt sick at the thought. Sir, I would not recommend it. What happened at Stavelot was pure accident. Trying to replicate it would be difficult and unpredictable. Also, it would violate the Geneva Conventions. Deliberately sabotaging fuel could be considered chemical warfare. The colonel nodded. I agree. Just asking the question. The brass always wants to turn accidents into weapons. He stood up. You did good work at Stavelot, Hayes. Holding that observation post, coordinating the counterattack. Your actions helped trap a dangerous enemy force. There is a Bronze Star being processed for you. After the colonel left, Hayes walked to the window and looked out at the Brussels streets. Life was slowly returning to normal in the liberated city. Children played in the squares. Shops were reopening. People were learning to live again without fear of German occupation. Hayes thought about Muller and his men. By now they would be in permanent POW camps, probably in France or England. They would survive the war. Eventually, they would go home to whatever remained of Germany. Hayes wondered if Muller blamed him for not warning about the fuel. Probably. But war made enemies of men who might have been friends in other circumstances. 400 kilometers away, Oberst Heinrich Muller sat in a prisoner of war camp near Cherbourg, France. The camp held thousands of German officers, waiting for the war to end and peace to begin. The conditions were not terrible. They had food, shelter, medical care. But they also had time. Time to think about what had happened. Time to regret. Muller spent his days reading whatever books he could find and writing letters that might never be delivered. He wrote to the families of men who had died under his command. He wrote to his own family, though he had no idea if they were still alive. Berlin was being destroyed. His wife and children might already be dead. One afternoon, Lieutenant Weber appeared at his barracks. The young officer looked thinner now, worn down by captivity and the knowledge of Germany's defeat. But his eyes were still sharp and intelligent. Sir, I heard news from the other prisoners, Weber said quietly. Berlin has fallen. Hitler is dead. Germany has surrendered. The war is over. Muller felt nothing. No surprise, no grief, no relief. Just emptiness. He had known this was coming since that day in Stavelot when his tanks died on the road. Germany's defeat had been inevitable. The only question was how long the dying would take. How did Hitler die? Muller asked. Suicide, they say. In his bunker while Berlin burned around him. Weber sat down on the bunk. He sent millions of men to die for his mad dreams. Then he took the coward's way out and shot himself. They sat in silence for a while. Around them, other German officers were reacting to the news. Some wept. Some cheered quietly, glad the killing was finally over. Some sat stunned, unable to process that the mighty German Reich had been completely destroyed. Do you think about the fuel? Weber asked. About how we lost. Muller nodded. Every day, we were defeated by an accident, by contaminated fuel that nobody properly tested. If we had taken one more day, if Koch had done thorough tests, if I had been less desperate, we might have discovered the problem before it destroyed us. And then what? We would have retreated to find other fuel. We would have fought other battles. We still would have lost the war. Germany was finished the moment we invaded Russia. Maybe even before that. Perhaps, Muller said. But at least my men would have died fighting, not sitting helpless on a road while their tanks turned to junk around them. Weber shook his head. With respect, sir, I disagree. Because we surrendered, 800 men survived. If we had kept fighting, how many would be dead now? All of us. And Germany would still have lost. The fuel did not just destroy our tanks. It saved our lives. Muller had never thought of it that way. But Weber was right. If the fuel had been good, they would have pushed deeper into American territory. They would have fought more battles. Most of them would be dead by now. The contaminated fuel had accidentally given them the gift of survival. You are wiser than I am, Lieutenant, Muller said quietly. No, sir. Just younger. I have more years ahead of me to live with the memories. I prefer to find the good parts when I can. The years passed. Germany was divided and occupied. The prisoner of war camps slowly emptied as soldiers were repatriated to whatever remained of their homes. Muller returned to find his family alive, but living in ruins. Weber went back to Bavaria and eventually became a teacher, educating a new generation of Germans about the horrors of war. Captain Hayes returned to America, to his wife and his farm in Ohio. He rarely spoke about the war. When people asked about his Bronze Star, he would say he earned it for defending a supply depot. He never mentioned the contaminated fuel or the German division that destroyed itself. In 1963, nearly 20 years after the war, a package arrived at Hayes's farm. It contained a letter written in careful English. Hayes recognized the handwriting from interrogation reports. It was from Muller. The letter was simple. Muller wrote that he had finally learned the full story of the contaminated fuel from captured American documents that were being released. He wrote that he understood Hayes had known about the contamination but chose not to warn the Germans. He wrote that he did not blame Hayes for this. They had been enemies. Hayes had done his duty, but Muller also wrote something else. He thanked Hayes for accepting the German surrender, for treating the prisoners with dignity, for not ordering a massacre of helpless men. In war, Muller wrote, there were many opportunities for cruelty. Hayes had chosen mercy. That mattered more than the fuel had ever mattered. Hayes read the letter several times, then carefully folded it and put it in a box with his other war memorabilia. He never replied to it. What could he say? That he felt guilty for not warning them? That he was relieved the fuel had destroyed their division? That he still sometimes dreamed about those burned-out tanks on the Belgian road? The truth was complicated. War was complicated. Right and wrong blurred together in ways that haunted both the winners and the losers. In 1975, a Belgian historian placed a small memorial at the site of the battle. It marked the spot where Kampfgruppe Muller had been destroyed by contaminated fuel. The memorial listed the names of the German soldiers who had died there, killed by American artillery and air attacks during the surrender. 23 names. 23 men who did not make it to the prisoner of war camps. The memorial also included a plaque with a quote from an unknown soldier. We came seeking fuel for our tanks and found poison. We came seeking victory and found defeat. We came seeking glory and found only the bitter truth that war makes fools of us all. The burned-out hulks of the German tanks were eventually cut up for scrap metal. The steel was melted down and used to rebuild Europe. Bridges, buildings, railways. The instruments of war transformed into the tools of peace. It seemed fitting somehow. Today, the roads through the Ardennes forest are busy with tourists and trucks. Few people know that 60 German tanks once died there, poisoned by 50,000 gallons of contaminated fuel. Few people remember Muller or Weber or Hayes. The veterans are gone now, taking their memories and their guilt and their wisdom to the grave, but the lesson remains. War is chaos. Victory and defeat often hinge on the smallest details. A mixed fuel drum, a hasty decision, a desperate gamble. And sometimes the greatest acts of mercy happen when we choose to let go of the need for revenge and simply let our enemies survive. The contaminated fuel at Stavelot killed a Panzer division. But in a strange way, it also saved 800 lives. It ended one battle quickly, preventing weeks of fighting and dying. It showed that sometimes defeat comes not from enemy strength, but from our own mistakes. And it proved that even in the darkest hours of war, there is still room for humanity, for mercy, for the choice to spare lives rather than take them. That, in the end, was the real story of the 50,000 gallons of free fuel that destroyed Hitler's elite Panzer division. Not just a story of military disaster, but a story of how small accidents can change the course of history, and how the choices we make in war echo long after the guns fall silent.